I'm Sabina Vaught, Director of the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to the Digital Freedom Leadership Project. This project consists of a series of brief conversations with leaders reflecting on one of their guiding principles. The project's designed as a resource to support educational leaders doing freedom work everywhere. Joining today for a conversation about one of her leadership principles is Dr. Ujju Aggarwal. Dr. Aggarwal serves as coordinator of the Self-Directed Learning Program at the New School, where she is also a faculty member in anthropology and experiential learning in the bachelor's program for adults and transfer students at the School of Public Engagement. Ujju has spent years as a leader in community organizing and popular education. She serves on the board of Teachers Unite, the advisory board of the Parent Leadership Project, which is part of the Bloomingdale Family Head Start program, and the advisory board of the Participatory Action Research Center for Education and Organizing. Her scholarly work examines questions related to public infrastructures, urban space, racial capitalism, rights, gender, and the state. Ujju, thank you for joining me in conversation as part of the Freedom Leadership Project.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabine. I'm really excited to be here and really honored to join you as somebody I've learned so much from and have been, really grateful to learn so much from over the past number of years, and both from your scholarship, but also how you embody leadership and mentorship. So thank you.
Goodness, you're always so generous and the feeling's very mutual. So I appreciate that. So I'll start with our first kind of prompt, which is to ask you to talk about or describe just one of your leadership principles and to maybe think with people who are listening or viewing about where it came from and how or why you chose to pay attention to or develop this particular principle.
So the principle I'll talk about today is care. But I want to begin by just kind of appreciating the question that the framing of the question. To me, it embodies kind of the practice of citation, of learning, of thinking about mentorship and leadership embodied. So I just want to say thank you for thinking with me, or kind of framing the question like that. Some of the questions that drive how I think about care really focuses on the question of the space of care, or the forms of social relationships and relationality that are cultivated when we care. And so instead of thinking about being free of care or care only as burdensome or extractive, what does it mean then to consider the relationalities or logics that can also be invoked or enlivened by care, particularly in places, for example, which Ruth Wilson Gilmore has termed as organized abandonment? What forms of knowledge are cultivated through these logics of care? What political futures do they direct us towards? So in thinking about my own learning, there's a few different places that this is kind of grown. And the first is stories that I grew up with, mainly from my mother, having to do with partition between India and Pakistan. And her mother, my Nanima, was a school teacher raising two daughters on her own, as well as her children. And they were living in what became Pakistan, and needed, like so many others, displaced in both directions to get across a border that was being made, that had been just made and was being made and enacted. And their passage, my mother reminded us, growing up through the stories she tells and retells to this day, was only made possible because of the relations of partition that had not yet broken, right? So it was a moment when care was enacted against the logic of partition and saved their lives, right? Assured their passage. And again, this was through kind of relationships that people held together against what they were being told should be separate. The second space that I feel like this was really formative space of learning for me around care was a church I grew up attending. My mother converted to Christianity soon after we migrated. She migrated to the US. And the place and time I was growing up in was one when factories were closing, farms were struggling, prisons were expanding and being built, and people were just really having a hard time. And it was in that church where on a regular basis, I witnessed grown men and women crying, expressing vulnerability, sharing what was hard. And this sharing of stories marked an invitation for others to share their own. And people understood it as their duty to support one another, to show up, to help out. Most figured out something to offer in this space. It wasn't always what was needed, and sometimes it wasn't even what was desired. And it was a far from perfect space. There was much I didn't agree with and was pushing back against, especially as a teenager. But a lot I did learn there, particularly about the practice of care in and as community. Kind of what some may consider in contradiction, but I don't really see it that way. Another place I learned about the principle of care or saw it in action that was really formative for me was Cuba. So it was something as a young adult who had not really traveled much outside of the United States. What I witnessed there completely blew my mind. It was during the special period, and what I saw enacted through neighborhood associations and other formations was a space of care as an expanded community. Where you couldn't really distinguish, for example, which family a child belonged to, because the relations formed through care and collectivity expanded beyond the individual household. And a child was understood as being the responsibility of an entire community. And that wasn't just kind of enacted formally, but it was through relationships. And finally, another space of care that's been important to me in terms of learning has been the Parent Leadership Project, project that I've worked on and in for the past couple decades, and particularly rooted in a Head Start center. In the tradition of Head Start, almost every teacher is a former parent. It's a small fact, but it makes a big difference that maybe we can talk about later. But for now, I'll just say that it marks an accumulation of care that's not always qualified by friendship or niceness or even getting along, but it is qualified by an understanding of being in something together and needing to fight for and with one another. Where nobody is surplus, nobody is really disposable. So it's here where, again, in a space like that, marked by organized abandonment and premature death, where the stakes of life are high, but where care also signifies a space of joy, and the kind which Iris Morales, in her reflection of an occupation that she participated in before joining the Young Lords, notes that it taught what such spaces made clear to her was a power of community, and I'm quoting the quote, power of community and joy of taking care of one another. And it's that joy and practice and day in and day out work that grows, I think, a particular sensibility, one that, like a muscle, creates our capacity to stretch our political horizons through embodied praxis that otherwise we wouldn't really have the capacity to extend our collective visions or dreams. That it's an enactment in a moment that extends beyond that moment, that gives us a glimpse of possibilities beyond kind of the not-for-profit industrial complex or reformist solutions that are about liberal freedom or neoliberal logics that really, again, are about a creativity and a place of creating relationships, but also sometimes survival and sometimes uh, community together.
You're such an exquisite storyteller. I always love to listen to you, and I'm imagining people watching this or listening to this and just re-listening and re-listening, because the sort of beautiful ease, I know it's not easy, but ease with which you connect the intimate and the global and all the sort of layers of the political and people across space and time. It's just extraordinary. I wish I could re-listen to it right now, but one of the things I always appreciate in hearing you talk about care and the rich way you think about care is that, there's and I'm not going to do this justice, but I want to try to pull something together here that I'm hearing in these stories. You said people don't have to like each other, or people may be together based on affiliation with a church or a family, a kinship network, or through neighborhoods, or through childcare need, or through whatever large and small movements of power and culture. But the care doesn't necessarily always feel good. And I think I heard that in a new way as you were telling these stories, that and it might not bring the carer a reciprocity of good feeling, but it's this larger, I heard you describing a larger principle or sensibility of responsibility to the sort of multiple forces a group of people are contending with. Did I get that right?
Yeah, no, that's I'm like, thank you, Sabina. That's a much better way of describing it. And helping me think also about this tension, right? Because I think that we're often told that care looks a certain way or feels a certain way or is supposed to be enacted in a certain way, and that's not always true, right? In my own experience, and I think in so many of ours. But I think what I've learned, it is very much about that feeling of responsibility together, as you're saying. And I was trying to come up with a term that wasn't about like non-judgmental, because it's not like somebody's sitting there saying, let me not be judgmental, right? But it is about an understanding that we can't lose each other, right?
I love that. So we can't lose each other. We might not be nice to each other, but we can still care. And the caring is about not losing or keeping sight and responsibility collectively for shared, though not necessarily identical, purposes.
Yeah, and part of it, I think, is also thinking about, that I think, at least in my own experience, part of it is that it's not that people are without judgment at all, ever, right? But it is that people have been judged by the liberal structures that enact exclusion against them, and so are hesitant about reenacting those same structures sometimes, right? It's not like they don't, but I think, with the mutuality, with the solidarity that is grown, there's a different type of reluctance to create exclusions, right? That are about membership to the community or care, right? That people know they need to survive. So So I think it's more about that. It's not like we've reached some kind of next level of enlightenment where people are not judgmental. No, but it's that, again, I think the knowledge that one, survive, the stakes are high, right? And then two, the kind of experience of having been not only judged, but excluded, right?
Mhm. So they might not wake up at 5 to bake you cookies every morning, but
Definitely not, or most likely not.
most likely not. But lives are interdependent, and
Yeah.
which that framing you just offered, I think, is such a perfect segue to the second prompt, which is to invite you to share a story of a time you applied or enacted or engaged care in a leadership context.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question and the prompt. And I guess it's less, I mean, so a lot of my, as you mentioned, a lot of my training grows out of working as a community organizer and popular educator. Um, and I think what it's helped me pay attention to is the work, particularly the popular education based work, is the structures that are not always the structures of organizing that are not always made visible and sometimes misrecognized. And so the story that I'll share today is actually one that you've heard before, but that comes from the Parent Leadership Project, and kind of, I think, hopefully shows some of the ways that the sensibility, the logic of care is something that we might think about as a portal that we can enter maybe together or begin enacting together, and maybe think then more about where we see that or recognize it or work to build those structures or infrastructures. So as I mentioned, I've been part of an organizing project at a Head Start Center, the Bloomingdale Family Head Start Center, for a while. And part of this work involved just creating a weekly group that would come together to navigate public elementary school admissions. The kind of said purpose of the group should have been simple, right? It was to work to learn about the schools, to find good schools, and good was identified and kind of determined what good meant by members. And to then also organize to make sure that all schools in the district were good and reflected the community. These kind of simple goals became much harder in the context in which we were organizing in the aftermath, particularly of the Great Recession, when in response to austerity, public elementary schools were expanding choice-based programs. And this looked like a range of programs from magnet programs to dual language programs to gifted and talented programs, general choice-based programs. But what the programs did was create a differential value as well as for administrators around kind of choosing, but then also a mechanism for active recruitment to families who, in the context of the financial crisis, were now considering public schools. So families with more economic capital who hadn't been necessarily dependent on, reliant on, or even open to sending their kids to public schools. And so a couple weeks before the kindergarten applications were due, at the Head Start Center, there was a kind of sense of increased anxiety. People had gone on school tours together, evaluated what they had visited, thought about the programs that were available, and also discussed collectively how they had been treated. And so the people were feeling pretty bad about the conditions that were out there because they were clear that they were not valued by the public schools. But one week there was kind of all of a sudden a lighter mood. And it turned out that when some of us were trying to figure out what had gone on, that one person had gotten address of a family member who then shared it, who lived in the zone of what everybody thought would be a really good school. And so the person decided to share it with everybody else in the group. who was applying, and those people then shared it with their neighbors and friends too. And so soon it became clear that everybody was going to be submitting applications with the same kindergarten address marked down as their with the same address marked down as their residential address. And so it created a little moment of confusion where, on one hand, it was kind of beautiful and invoked kind of the Zapatista wisdom of, right, we want everything for everyone. That's freedom. And then, but at the same time, we were hearing stories of people getting house visits, asking people's children being asked where they sleep at night. This was increasingly true kind of as the neighborhood was getting more and more segregated. And so, we mobilized quickly to make sure that everybody took off the address because it seemed like the stakes were too dire. But what was interesting in that moment was that there was a logic that as we were kind of doing one-on-ones and checking in with people, it didn't really make sense to the members of the Head Start Center who were sharing the address. For them, they questioned, well, if somebody was willing to share their address, why couldn't something that somebody desired to be shared instead of just like, if somebody wanted to share their home, why couldn't they share their home, essentially, right? And so on one hand, people may say, well, it's just because the people didn't, the members didn't understand the process of school choice, but it wasn't that they didn't understand it, right? We had spent weeks coming together, learning about the admissions process, rights, thinking about the application, accompanying each other, right? Doing all these things together. And so again, it wasn't that people didn't understand, it just was that they were enacting a different logic of care, right? That was really about, again, bonds of solidarity and mutuality, not always qualified by friendship, but somebody saying, you need something I have, I want to share it, we're in the same boat, let's be together, right? And thinking then about kind of a form of social relations, right, that extends beyond private property, that isn't about kind of a formal or declarative statement that one might make about kind of even private property, right? But it was a logic that extended beyond it. And it was really rooted, again, in the accumulation of relationships over time, where people had not just, it's not just a fact that teachers were former parents, but people had raised their children together, right? People had been in it together in significant ways. And in the space and the context, what that meant was coming together for joyous occasions and also defending each other against evictions, against the administration of children's services, but also, again, it wasn't just kind of against bad things. It was also towards good things. It was towards kind of celebrations of children's graduations and their own and their children's weddings. So being together again over time and the cultivation and accumulation of those relationships made, kind of, as you were saying, kind of a different sensibility of responsibility to one another through kind of, in this case, the institution and the neighborhood, where relationships then came to function much more like an extended family, where I don't get along with all of my extended family, but we're family together, right? And you're bound together generally in some ways that creates, again, a sense of accountability. So maybe I'll leave it there. I think one of the things just to kind of close out on is I think, so often when in my encounters in care, thinking about care, particularly around gentrification and the segregation that was taking place in the community over time, there were certain and kind of there were kind of overt and less overt ways that people were looked at as problems, right? Where the solution was supposed to lie in ideas of liberal inclusion that were sometimes about a parenting class, about learning how to take care or succeed, like those, right, who are supposed to be exemplary. But here it was really a different, it was a completely different logic of care that was, again, kind of, I think, directing us towards, like I think so many places and spaces are, but this is one small example, directing us towards, again, building that muscle to be able to dream or think more expansively. Because without that, all we really can do, I think, often is think about kind of be trapped within the reformist logic of liberal inclusion.
And I love hearing that story again, because I heard so many new things. One was a connection to what you said at the outset. I think right before, when you were talking about your mom, you talked about care, I think, as pulling knowledges forward and creating or building political futures. Did I get that right? I know that's not verbatim, but I hope I got close. Okay. So I heard you describing that with people not only enacting care, sharing an address with each other, but, as you said, the logics or the sensibilities of care. So bringing a knowledge forward to build a political future. I heard that in the sort of questioning of you all's questioning of the practice. So you,
Yeah.
as you say, this might not bode well, because now, however, several dozen people have the same residential address, and people responding to that with, so questioning. So I hear you describing the bringing the knowledge forward in that sort of challenging of what might feel like strategizing, but challenging it. And in that challenging, among you building in that sort of dialectic moment, building a political future. If I heard that right, that was sort of an exciting new thing I learned from hearing you tell this story.
Yeah, no, thank you. I feel like it's always, no, that's a much better way to put it. And yeah, I feel like it's helpful to talk about it with you, because I feel like, the conversation helps clarify for me what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so appreciating this. And I think people will be excited to think about care and leadership this way, not as a leader, a group of leaders expressing some sort of warmth or kindness, but as this interdependent and pretty rigorous responsibility that operates through all these political material dimensions of life.
Yeah, and just to go back to what you were saying, absolutely. I think that's one piece of it. And then I think that sensibility of how we actually extract ourselves out of, not just of reverting to kind of the protectionist kind of liberal response, or saying we need to do kind of things this way, as you're saying, around the strategizing, but how and where do we recognize the people who are said not to make sense, right? Or who might be told like, oh, well, you don't understand how the rules work, so let me teach you. How that sensibility, where there's actually collective sensibilities that are being shaped and exist, right, in the form of knowledge or relationships, or I think political capacity also, right, to then to learn from that, right, and to really pause, and instead of thinking about kind of slogans for the revolution, right? Where do we actually see kind of the enactment of those principles in practice in maybe unlikely places?
What a beautiful way to end. Oh, thank you, Uju. I
Thank
always learn so
you.
much from our conversations.
Me too. So thank you.